So I hope you all enjoy some time with Richard and John in Dialogos.
So I enjoyed your talk, so take that into consideration, but I was disappointed that you didn't give the talk that I thought you were going to give from the abstract. Because, I'm also a deep reader of Nietzsche, and I take him as one of the prophets of the meaning crisis. He certainly, I think, in some ways presents himself that way. And I'm not asking you to give a talk that you didn't give, but I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about that sort of Nietzschean take on, the death of God? And I'm always impressed by the fact that the madman pronounces that not to Christians but to atheists when he goes into the marketplace, and he says, you don't know what you've done. We've wiped away the sky. We're unchained from the sun. We're forever falling. And then he realizes that they can't understand what he's saying, and then and I've often reflected on that. And of course, he's not giving some crypto argument for theism. He's trying to say something else. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are around that, because you had at least put some preliminary thought into wrestling with the question of existential meaning, and I can see why that could also intersect with the important work you're doing on bioethics, especially around death, because many of I'm very familiar with the meaning in life literature, the psychology around that, and one of the things that seems to ameliorate the challenge of that is a sense of meaning in life. There's some good evidence around that. And so I just wanted to open it up for you to have a chance. And again, I know you don't have a prepared argument, and I'm not trying to catch you out or anything. I just wanted to give you an opportunity, a genuine opportunity.
All right. So John is referring to the title of the presentation this morning for the presentation I didn't give.
Yes.
Please keep in mind that this event was delayed for a considerable period of time.
Yes.
Time's gone by, and a lot of things have happened. So, sure, I can comment on that. My reading of Nietzsche is this. He takes what he calls the death of God to be a historical event. It's something which is happening in the 19th century when he was writing, but I think he regarded himself as something of a prophet.
Yes, very much.
And that it would be the people of the 20th century who would really have to deal with the fallout, which he talked about in terms of nihilism. And of course, nihilism, the loss of meaning, the thought that nothing matters, something which has been, I think, presented well in the literature of the 19th century. If God is dead, all is permitted, and so on. So it's the catastrophe, which is the death of God, which is not just, he wasn't, I think, just talking about the fact that the Christian religion is losing its power, that its time has passed, but that we're talking about a civilizational era, which really began with Plato, right? And that was the two-tiered theory of reality. So the Platonic view of the world of being as opposed to the world of becoming. Now, Nietzsche is a critic of this, of course, because he sees the Platonic view as a refutation or a denigration of life. The idea is to move up the line toward the form of good. Philosophy is a preparation for death, because at that point the soul can leave the body and dwell in unity with the forms and so on. But the message there is really an abnegation of life. So in a sense, Nietzsche is glad that the sun is setting on this Platonic Christian world order, Christianity being Platonism for the people. It's a sort of memorable phrase from Nietzsche. However, the situation demands a new creator, the Übermensch, somebody can give meaning to the earth. someone can give our civilization a direction without going back to a two-tiered world order, which is a devaluation of life. I like the way, now, I'm not sure I buy all this, and I'll explain why.
Sure.
I think someone who expressed it well was the Czech writer Milan Kundera, a novel entitled The Unbearable Lightness of Being.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first page. Have you read it?
I have it.
It's the very first page. Which
I've read the first page. So
okay, so I think, if I remember correctly, where he talks about the fact that if something happens only once, it might as well never have happened at all, because it will eventually be forgotten, right? And that's true. I mean, I think of, it was Julian Barnes, a British writer, who said of the First World War graveyards, for example, that these huge cemeteries, someday they won't mean anything to us. The living connection with the time and those people will be lost. And somebody will say, it's time we turn these things back into farmland again. And Kundera said, there might have been a war on the continent of Africa in, say, the 12th century we don't know about, in which case it doesn't matter. In the same way that if you ask people now, was Napoleon a good guy or a bad guy, they won't have an opinion on that, because the sense of the time and the cause has been lost. Now, I guess my thinking on that is that what Nietzsche is offering as a replacement for the Platonic Christian worldview is the thought of eternal recurrence, because he's trying to he's trying to think of a way in which our actions can be given significance. All right, so it sounds something like this. And I guess there are different ways you can interpret it. It sounds like a kind of Kantian imperative. Call it an existential imperative, maybe. When you're acting, act as if you are choosing for all time, and so you must live the consequences of this choice for all time. And that is a way of giving your actions weight or significance. The problem with that, for me, is that you know full well that it's just a hypothetical, it's a thought experiment. It has to be, these things have to be believed to have any moral weight to them. So I like to compare Nietzsche with, say, David Hume, who was an atheist and had embraced a secular worldview, but didn't see the loss of faith as a catastrophe, either personally or civilizationally. He did find the consequences of his thought somewhat depressing. And the solution to that is to play backgammon with his friends, go horseback riding, or a glass of claret. That would do. So that suggests to me, if you're comparing Hume with Nietzsche, Nietzsche is a deeply religious man who's reached this crisis point in terms of his own thinking. He simply cannot sustain faith in the Platonic Christian story anymore. Now, I guess I'm getting to the end of this.
I find it very interesting so far. So,
to this little overview, is that when we're talking, our actions have significance on a limited time scale. We don't have to be choosing for all time. It doesn't matter whether there'll come a day when we're all gone. Right? And so none of us will remember what the others did. And so the evil that we did won't matter. That's true. But living in the here and now, the good and bad that we do is significant on a local level. If I give you a ride to the hospital, I've done something good for you. In other words, you don't have to measure the significance of your actions by eternity. I think that's a mistake. And I'd make the same claim about morality in general. You don't have to measure the goodness of what you do by an eternal standard of the good. It's enough to do good on a local level and a finite level. It's still a good, if I give you a ride to the hospital, I've done something good for, even though both of us will be gone someday.
Yeah. Sorry, are you finished?
Yes, okay.
Okay. I have several comments on that. First of all, I agree that the significance of our actions shouldn't be measured against everlastingness or something like that. And I mean, I think Thomas Nagel in The Absurd makes a very good argument. If my actions don't matter to people a million years from now, then what people think a million years ago should not matter to me. The lack of significance is completely symmetrical. And so, and he makes a whole bunch of arguments about, to the effect that most of the purported arguments for nihilism actually aren't sort of logically valid arguments. I take it that's well said. But I have a couple of points. I mean, so outside of the Christian framework, you can see other solutions to that. One that easily comes to mind is Stoicism, that says, no, don't measure it horizontally, narratively through the extent through time. Measure it how deeply it connects to the depths of reality. So they propose a vertical depth, and that seems to track with the meaning in life literature, which is people don't seem to measure meaning of life psychologically by the everlastingness of what they're doing. That doesn't come out as a primary dimension. They measure it in terms of, are they connected to something that makes coherent sense? Does it have an existence and potentially a value independent of their own egocentric concerns? So it is meaningful to ask them, well, what would you like to exist in the universe even if you didn't? And they can say, oh, this, right? That's a meaningful thing. Mattering, they want to make a difference to something other than their egocentric concerns. And then realness, that whatever it is all of those other things are doing, they have to be real. They can't be illusory or a simulation or it's a trick. I sometimes do the experiment where, a thought experiment with some of my students, and I'll say, suppose this happened to you when you turn 21 and your parents take you in and they say, come here, John. I'll use me because it's safe for me to use my name for me because using names now is dangerous. So anyways, I want to show you something, and my parents, they're both dead, so it's also a safer example. And they take me to a hallway, and they push a button, and a door opens, and they go in, and I'm asking my students to put themselves in this position, and your parents say to you, we were actually hired 21 years ago to have you by the government, and they show you all these files and these tapes, and they taught us what we should say to you, and how to pretend to care about you and everything. And we're not going to change anything we're doing. We're just going to say all the same words, and that's it. And we can go back and just forget it. And I ask my students, well, how do you feel now? And they all say, well, horrible, horrible. And it's like, but none of the behaviors are changing. Everything else. But because it's a simulation now, because the connectedness is within a simulation rather than a reality, they reject it. They'll do the same thing like this. So the God replacement for our culture right now is romantic relationships, which is one of the great mistakes our culture is making. Imagine trying to make a romantic relationship with a fallible, broken human being carry the weight of God and history and culture. You're going to do that for me. It's like, right, great idea. And I ask my students, how many of you are in really satisfying romantic relationships? And they put their hands up. And I say, okay, those of you who do, put your hand up again if you would like to know that your partner was cheating on you, even though that would completely destroy the relationship. And almost all of them put their hands back up because they don't. And then I ask them, Richard, and here's all my hard-bitten, nihilistic, postmodern students. Why not? Well, because it isn't real, right? Right? And it's like, wow, you're really ready to use that word right there, right? And so the point I'm making is these are just thought experiments that bear out in the empirical literature. So I don't think, there's nothing in there about I need to be connected to something that will never pass away. That doesn't come up very much. But there is, so if you allow me to use a horizontal metaphor, that doesn't seem to matter too much to people. Like you can say to people, within 5 generations, there won't be anybody that remembers you, and they'll go, I'm okay with that. That doesn't bother them too much. But if you say to them, it's not real, or you're not connected to something other than yourself, that really bothers them. That's really bothering. So I think we should give up the idea of the everlasting, and Paul and Jonathan are going to get angry at me right now, but I'm just going to keep making this argument for a bit. And you see in Stoicism and Buddhism, and I would argue in Platonism, because I think Nietzsche gets Plato quite wrong. I think third wave Platonism has really made that case very well. Now I'm coming around to my point. We have, and notice what I'm doing this. And that's the metaphor that people use for this, other than extended for all time, depth of reality. And they do this vertical thing. We have this prevalent metaphor, and it's bound in so many of our other metaphors for trying to talk about that in terms of an upper and a lower, a two worlds mythology. And so part of the way I talk about the meaning crisis is we inherited from the axial revolution this whole new way of talking that emphasizes the vertical dimension. You see it in Plato, you see it in the Stoics. But it got bound up with, as you said, with respect to Nietzsche, a two worlds mythology. And we are losing the two worlds as a plausible hypothesis about the structure of reality. But that doesn't mean we can throw away all of the practices by which we have tried to explore that vertical dimension of depth. And so that, to me, is a way of trying to understand the meaning crisis. How do we rehome those practices that gave us access to the vertical dimension that plausibly show up in increased measurements of meaning in life when we no longer have an ontology, at least those of us committed to a scientific worldview, we no longer have an ontology that legislates or at least legitimates the two worlds mythology that homes those practices. Does that make sense as a proposal?
It really does. But I quick follow-up question then. What's the meaning of meaning here? Is it function?
No.
Purpose?
So meaning is being used as a metaphor here, right? Which is something. So the idea is there's something like semantic meaning, the way semantic meaning binds the elements of a sentence together and then binds me to the world so that truth is possible for me. There's something about how I am cognitively, existentially fitted to the world that binds the world together and binds me to the world in a way so that I can flourish within it in a meaningful, in a fashion that makes it worthwhile to keep living given all the suffering and failure in life.
Is that, okay, so Nietzsche again.
Yeah.
If you have a why anyhow is possible, that famous line. So is that what we're talking about?
I think that's what we're talking about. If you really broaden the why to not be something that is going to be answerable with sort of a propositional sentence, but more about an older model of virtue, something that integrates beliefs, skills, states of mind, traits of character, so that one is properly comported towards the world. Very much some important similarities to Heidegger's notions of authenticity, that you're properly oriented towards being in a way that supports your agency, especially in its human capacities for self-interpretation and self-transformation.
Okay, so I'm having trouble cashing out meaning in terms other than function or purpose. And I'm thinking of Aristotle and Nicomachean Ethics.
Well, for example, let's use Aristotle then. So the thing closer in Aristotle to what I'm talking about isn't sort of the notion of function, but closer to what he has in the conformity theory of knowing, that there's some way in which the mind and reality are sharing and participating in a connectedness, a contact. Charles Taylor's idea about a contact epistemology versus a representational epistemology.
I think I brought some Aristotle along with me.
Okay.
Let's see if I got it.
That's kind of impressive. I can't pull anything out of my pocket that has a philosopher.
I did. Here it is.
Okay.
It's from the Nicomachean Ethics. It's a famous line where he is talking about the function of a man, right? He says, have the carpenter then and the tanner certain functions or activities, and has man none? Is he born without a function, or is eye, hand, foot, in general, each of the parts evidently has a function? May one lay it down that man similarly has a function apart from all these? And of course, these are rhetorical questions. Well, of course not. If the hand and the foot have a function, well, the man himself must have a function. And then
Right.
so he goes on to fill that out, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
But okay, I guess the problem I'm objecting to is that, especially the Aristotelian notion of function is bound up with the teleology. And so and given that evolution has removed teleology, and you're left with something like adaptivity, and biologists will try to understand function non-teleologically in terms of adapted fittedness, then I'm okay with that, if that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Now, just for the record, I do worry about what Nietzsche called the death of God, because we seem to be running an experiment right now in moving towards secular society. And this is something we haven't seen before. That all culture societies have had, as far as I know, have had religion. And so this experiment, this may not work out well.
Yes.
Okay, then my question would be, given your sort of vertical sense rather than the horizontal, the distant sense of meaning, how does religion then provide that? And maybe the question I asked Jonathan this morning is religion one of the best ways or the best way of providing that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
The poor guy's been talking all day.
I'm not laughing at you at all, Richard. The point is there's a profound irony in you asking me that question.
When they first invited me here, the idea was where we're looking for common ground, right?
Yep.
Not debates, not arguing, which is good because a whole weekend's a long time to be fighting with people. So, well, this is actually an area of commonality.
No, I agree, and
shared
I
concern.
think your question is well placed, and there was nothing inappropriate of you asking it of me. It just puts me in a strange position. I want to respond in good faith. Pun there. I want to respond in good faith to your question. It's not there's a sense in which the 50 hours of awakening from the meaning crisis is directed exactly to that question. Has religion been a place in which people have cultivated ecologies of practices that have allowed them to deal with the self-deceptive, self-destructive aspects of our cognition and enhance the senses of connectedness to themselves, to other people, to the world, and in a way that many cultures have called wisdom? Has it done that? Has it homed that? Yes. Is there even current research about that right now? Yes. My RA has done pretty good research showing that if people are trying to cultivate wisdom, the people within the religious traditions do better than the secular people. Now, before you get all happy about that, there doesn't seem to be any significant difference between the religions with respect to that success, which I have taken to mean that the propositional levels at the top is not the thing that is accounting for the success of the religions in helping cultivate wisdom. I think that's a reasonable interpretation. And that's convergent with a lot of other arguments. So I want to, sorry, that's stupid, you don't care what I want. I'm proposing that there is a lot to be learned in deep respect and good faith dialogue from the religions about how to home ecologies of practices such that people can viably reduce foolishness, self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, enhance meaning in life, but that I am concerned, I'm not totally convinced, that's why I continue to talk so deeply with Paul and with Jonathan, but I'm concerned that the religions are so bound up in many ways, the legacy religions, and I would include Buddhism in this too, by the way, with a two worlds mythology, that they are not capable of answering this particular problem that we're talking about, which is how do we rehome ecologies of practices that activate and give us access to the vertical dimension without having to buy into a two worlds mythology. I'm concerned that they're not able to do that. So paradoxically, I talk about a religion that's not a religion. It's a religion in the sense that it is serving a lot of the functionality that religion serves, but it doesn't have some of the central grammar that the two worlds mythologies that are found in the axial age religions, and we have now sort of taken as defining features of what a religion is. And so that is why I had to give you that very strange initial response, because I also propose that working out what that means both theoretically and practically, I work with what you could call non-religious, not anti-religious, but non-religious emerging communities of practices that are creating these ecologies and having success and trying to figure out what's going on there. I work with those and trying to understand exactly, well, what is that functionality? How can we afford it? Because one of the fastest growing demographics are the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. These are the people that declare they have no official religious allegiance. That doesn't mean that most of them are Sam Harris type atheists. When you take a look at the demographics, most of them are seekers, and they describe themselves with the very popular and utterly meaningless phrase, spiritual but not religious. And then I'm trying to figure out what's that? For me, that's just a placeholder. They're trying to articulate that they want these ecologies of practices. They don't want the religious framework. And I'm hoping that something like this, and I'm not trying to set up, Jonathan, you shouldn't accuse me of that. I don't want to be the founder of a religion, and neither do I want to be the figurehead of a religion. And if the job's offered to me and it involves limousines and cash, I still won't take it. But I do think this is emerging, and it's emerging very fast. These communities are trying to network together into a subculture. And I think that is where we can plausibly see a way of life that could be of deep value to the nuns. That's my proposal.
Okay, another question then, and this is one I put to Jonathan this morning, is can you have the goods of a religion without some kind of dogma, a story?
Okay, so I think that's an excellent question, and part of it is to understand.
If there is, I'm ready to buy into it now.
Yeah. Well, no. But what I mean is, first of all, we have to remember that we can't be too ethnocentric about the use of the term religion. The idea of this entity religion as something distinct and separable, there isn't even a word for it in other cultures. So, right, and we have a sort of a very belief-centric notion of religion. We often will use a belief system as a synonym for religion. And for me, if you take a look, you can see that in many other places, the creedal aspect of how people are trying to cultivate wisdom, depth, realness, real connectedness, is not primary. Instead, the religio, the practices of binding, that's what religio means, right, are central and are considered important. Now, that doesn't mean that people are willy-nilly ad hoc. They have something much more like an orthopraxy than an orthodoxy. They're like, and so, for example, Taoism is much more like that, and I've been doing Taoist practices for nearly 3 decades. And in one way you can describe Taoism, it's the religion of flow. It's the religion that gets you into the flow state, and the flow state is when you feel this powerful depth and connectedness, and your agency is enhanced, and your egocentrism goes away, and boy, does it percolate through your life, and you find it just changing things. Is that a religion? I don't know.
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, so for me, my answer is yes and no. It's a religion in the sense that it is a powerful set of an ecology of practices, a complex ritual that brings about a profound transformation that discloses aspects of myself and the world and affords me transforming in relation to that disclosure. But does it commit me to, a complex set of doctrines? There's this stuff about the Tao, but the Tao that can be spoken of is not the Tao, and so the doctrine is this undermining thing. I'm not here to advocate Taoism, by the way. That's not what I'm trying to do. But what I am arguing is Taoism a religion? I think, is Taoism really helping people reduce foolishness, enhance connectedness, improve agency, all the stuff? Yes. Can it lead to powerful, mystical, or transformative experiences? You better believe it. Reliable. Does it make real physiological and cognitive differences in people? Yes. But is it a religion in the way that we've come to think of religion? And so, for me, there are things that, in that sense, are religions but not religions. And I'm not saying, one more time, I'm not saying Taoism is the answer, but it means that I'm not talking about an empty category. I'm talking about a possibility of something here.
Okay, so I think I'm in agreement when you're talking about looking at religion as a belief system. And
Yeah.
it's typically what philosophers do, right?
Yes, yeah.
They look at religions as a set of propositions.
Which is
are these reasonable to believe?
Yeah.
And religions typically don't come off very well when you do that.
Yes.
And the newer the religion is, the worse it is. See Scientology or Mormonism or something. I mean, the stories, right?
Yeah.
But, of course, religions work in other ways and do other things. Right?
Yes.
So it's the collective participation in ritual, for example, which is very effective in building a sense of unity and in community. All the social goods and psychological goods come of that. And I think once you see that, it may not matter. The dogma may be irrelevant.
Is that a break?
Okay, I'll take a breather if you want.
No. I don't want to impose. But again, one of the things I've been arguing as a cognitive scientist coming out of 4E cognition, which, by the way, is deeply influenced by Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, etc., is the idea that there are different ways of knowing. There's not only propositional knowing that, there's procedural knowing how, there's perspectival knowing what it's like, there's participatory knowing, which is to have the agent-arena relationship that opens up the very affordance of cognition. And these have different kinds of memory associated with them, they have different normative standards associated with them, and they result in different things. Procedural knowledge doesn't result in beliefs, it results in skills. Perspectival knowledge doesn't result in beliefs or skills, it results in perspectives. Participatory knowledge results in identities, roles, etc. And I think that Religio works very well at the non-propositional level. That's the first proposal. And then the second proposal is that is most of where the connectedness that drives meaning in life is actually being generated. And so that religion, insofar as it's in the service of Religio and not Credo, can make a very good claim, to go back to the empirical research, for being a place for training wisdom, if what we mean by wisdom is the enhancement of the non-propositional ways in which we are affording meaning-making. And like you, I think, I tend to get very hesitant when we move up to the propositional level, because of the pluralism argument. We have all these different belief systems. They can't all possibly be true. We don't seem to have any standard beyond them by which we can compare them or evaluate them. And then what typically happens is most of the comparisons drop down to the non-propositional level, either explicitly or implicitly, to try and say, this is why this is better, this is why this is better, this is why this is better. And so I guess I'm proposing that religion is particularly good at enhancing non-propositional knowing, and that non-propositional knowing is where most of the work of meaning, in the sense we've been talking about here as religio, of bindingness and connectedness, is actually taking place. So if we throw out the propositional bathwater, we're going to throw out the baby that allows us to cultivate a lot of wisdom. But how do we do that without committing our allegiance to the propositional? Did that make sense?
Years ago, I was a big fan of Joseph Campbell, read a lot of his works, and of course, he suggested that we need a new mythology, right?
Yes.
A replacement mythology. And he suggested that the Apollo astronauts might be the questing heroes of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And of course, I think most people could probably name more Star Trek characters than they could Apollo astronauts. I mean, it just wasn't a plausible, theory. But more importantly, the mythologies of the past weren't mythologies.
No.
Right? So in the modern, we think of mythology as a story, a myth, something which is false, that humanity in its childhood took seriously, but we're sophisticated now, that kind of thing. So for a new mythology to allow the social goods, or psychological goods that we're talking about, it would have to be believed and not recognized as a myth.
Well, yeah and no. So first of all, I agree with you. Myths aren't stories about the ancient past that we no longer believe because we have science. Campbell and Jung, right, and Jordan Peterson. Myths are stories about, they're prophetic in the biblical sense, not as foretelling the future, but as getting us to become aware of profound patterns that are pertinent and that have been forgotten. That's Campbell's thesis in a nutshell, and Jung's thesis in a nutshell. And I think there's something valuable about that. And then I put that together with Lerman's work, How God Becomes Real, one of the best cognitive anthropologists around, and she talks about these three different senses of real. And she talks about, I just want to talk about this, and for the Christians here, I'm not trying to in any way undermine your Christianity. I really don't like that. That's not what I want to do. But she talks about the way, and you'll see why I said what I gave that preamble. She talks about the way Jesus is real is different from how the table is objectively real, or my pain is subjectively real. And she says Jesus is not real in either one of those ways. And she proposes this third way in which Jesus is real. And I think that is properly the domain of myth. And for me, that's the transjective. That's that which binds the subjective and the objective together. It's that which creates affordances between the organism and the environment. The graspability of the cup is not in the cup, nor is it in my hand, but in a real relationship. The adaptivity of the shark is not in the shark or in the water, but in the relationship between them. And so I think in this, what Lerman is saying is that Jesus is real, not subjectively or objectively, but transjectively. Matt Rossano argues something very similar in Supernatural Selection. And there's a lot of things that are real in that important way. And I think Heidegger's notion of aletheia is that kind of notion actually as well. And so you can have very profound versions of this, some less profound. And I think myths work that way. I think myths don't have to be believed in our Cartesian sense of asserting a proposition. I think they work insofar as they really fit us to those pertinent patterns. So let me give you an example from my own life. I've tried to adopt the Socratic way of life, and I don't just mean as some sort of deeply, profoundly. Am I convinced that the Socrates of Plato is a historically accurate portrayal? No. But does it connect me to what's going on in Plato or Socrates and how they're merged together, such that my life continues to be profoundly enriched and transformed? Yes. And in that way, Socrates is real to me. But that's not the same thing as saying it's just a subjective thing or Socrates is objectively real, because it's something that I can get wrong, it's something I can be mistaken about, and therefore there is a normativity to it. And that's how I think myths have to be. Now, I think I would say on your behalf back to me, sorry, that's a weird thing to do. So maybe that's good, John, but then that surely means that myths have to emerge in a really different way. I don't think we can just, and I think Campbell would agree, we can't just, here's our new myth, I'm just going to write a myth. Myths can't, if I decide to write a myth, I will completely fail in generating a myth. If I wait, I'm going to wait till reality gives me a myth. But I think about something like Moby Dick.
Did L. Ron Hubbard not do just that? I mean, he was a science fiction writer before he became a religious leader.
Yeah, but the thing about that is exactly the dysfunctionality, right? He created it, and it doesn't actually, I don't want to get too much into critiquing Scientology, but it doesn't plug into anything. I mean, it's not subjectively the case. It's clearly not objectively real. You know, Xenu and all that stuff, that makes no sense. And yet, it doesn't seem to also make its adherents wiser, as far as I can tell. And for me, given what I've already argued, the important question to ask a myth is not, is it true or false? Does it reliably make people who partake in it wiser? That's the question I would ask. So I guess what I'm saying is the question, the harder question, I agree with you totally. I like to use the Greek word mythos as to distinguish from myth because of the current connotation and even denotation, right? So we can't make mythos, even though Romanticism sort of tried that really hard. Maybe we can just make art and it'll just do that for us, right? And we can't just wait for it. And we somehow have to participate in its self-emergence. And that goes back to stuff we were saying earlier about this sort of, you know, Slingerland's book, Trying Not to Try. How do I get into that place? We were talking about it downstairs when we were asked that question. And so for me, it's like the difficult question, and then I'll shut up, is how can we properly dispose ourselves so that we can participate in the emergence of myth? And the proposal I've made about that is that we can try and get very powerful processes of dialogos that give us access to the collective intelligence of distributed cognition in a powerful and palpable way. And these are also emerging things. Taylor Barrett's here, one of the people that has been part of the emergence of the circling practice as a new practice that does this. And you can see mythology being born in these practices. No one person does anything, but the circling is going on, and they get a sense of the we space that's not being made by you or me, but all of us, and it's leading us in a place, and they start to use religious languages regardless of whether they came from a secular or religious background. And you can see a new way, a new language, even that language I just used, the we space, as a term, a mythological term, a mythos term, not a myth term, but a mythological term, trying to, you can see a myth emerging. I'm proposing that right here, right? I just want to check. Taylor, is that fair what I'm saying? Yeah. There you go, okay.
Okay, before we run out of time, I've got to take us in a different direction for
Please.
a bit. Talk about the meaning crisis. And I do have reservations about talking about a crisis.
Sure.
For example, Heidegger talked about as a crisis, the forgetfulness of being. And I've never been clear what the forgetfulness of being is.
Sure.
But people tend to cash it out to whatever was happening at the time. Okay, it could be the rise of fascism in the 30s, environmental problems, that see it as confirmation of it. Mm-hmm. And so, here's the worry, is that we never face one crisis, but it's many. And the individual crises have particular solutions. Sure. But not the solution to the problem of forgetfulness of being, whatever that is. Sure. And so, Heidegger was sort of drawing on the crisis in Marburg theology. Mm-hmm. So he adapted that idea to his own purposes. So I think in any era in human history, there are going to be problems. Sure. Which people could talk about in terms of a crisis. It's a turning point, right?
Kairos, yeah.
So maybe we focus on this the idea of crisis writ large, at the expense of actually addressing problems, the individual problems on a smaller scale, which actually have solutions which are easier to apply. So that's that. I don't know if I'm being clear.
No, that's good.
That's the worry that I have.
No, it's a good worry. First of all, although there's a single adjective, the meaning crisis, it's not meant to be a single causal thing. It's meant to be a dynamical system of many different factors interacting very powerfully. And the problem with our articles is they don't give us an article for talking about that kind of entity. So what I would say is, what I'm trying to put my finger on with the meaning crisis is the cultural cognitive ability to find oneself homed in the cosmos, which would be the opposite of nihilism, and that our culture in general is moving not towards a cosmic home, but away from it, nihilism and the nuns, etc., and that puts us into a profound kind of scarcity mentality. So if we take it that meaning is a substantial need, and there's, I think, a ton of psychological literature that really supports that. So I'm not going to argue for that extensively here. And then you have the literature, the scarcity mentality literature, which is whenever you put human beings in a scarcity about one of their needs, it has the result of making them short-term thinkers, rigid thinkers, and much more prone to cognitive bias in their thinking. So if there is a meaning scarcity in the way I've described, that it is putting us into a scarcity mentality at a very fundamental level of how we connect to ourselves, the world, and other people, that then reduces the kind of cognitive flexibility, depth, and expansiveness we need in order to respond to all of the X risk factors that we're facing. That's what I'm trying to put my finger on by this term, the meaning crisis.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Since this is probably the last time I'll a chance to talk to you, but just want to thank everybody for coming. I've had some terrific conversations with people over the weekend. I really appreciate John taking the time to come. You're chair of your department, right?
Pardon me?
Are you chair of your department?
I'm chair of the program, yeah.
Chair of the program. I imagine it was difficult to get away for this length of time, right? The beginning of the semester.
Yep.
So
I had to, I crammed a lot into the days before I came here so that I could come here, yes.
Yeah, so but it's difficult for you to be here, so I really appreciate you coming.
I am really glad you're here. You must feel like in some ways they dropped you off in intellectual Papua New Guinea or something, and you're like, what the heck? What are these strange customs and these strange languages, and why do these people not orient the way? So I admire, first of all, your patience and your graciousness and your willingness to engage in good faith, and that's come through. It's good getting to know you.